Hello, everyone, and welcome from the College of Arts and Sciences, the College of Engineering, and the Ohio State University Alumni Association. Thank you so much for joining us for Effect of COVID-19 on Mobility. Note that all attendees are muted and your video is off. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to submit questions by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Now, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Chris Atkinson, Director of the Ohio State University Smart Mobility Program.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, The Effect of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Mobility. And thanks to the Ohio State University, thanks to the College of Engineering, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Ohio State University Alumni Association for arranging this webinar. We have 5 panelists who are going to talk about the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on mobility at OSU, in Central Ohio and beyond. But before I introduce them, I want to tell you a little about what this webinar will be in its format. Firstly, we'll hear from each of the 5 panelists in turn, and then we will cut to some questions. And many questions have been submitted by you, the audience, in advance. And please submit questions in the Q&A feature that you have on your screen as we progress. The motivation behind this webinar is, as I said, what has been the effect of the pandemic on mobility at OSU, in Central Ohio, and in the world beyond? What has OSU and the Central Ohio Transit Authority been doing in response to the pandemic? What should OSU and others, including transit authorities, do in the future based on what we now know about the pandemic? And of course, from OSU's point of view, we're interested in how is the pandemic and how are the lessons we're learning from it? How should that impact what we do about education, research, development, and innovation at OSU and beyond? So it begs the question, what is mobility? For a start, we know what transportation is. Transportation is the movement of goods and services, people, goods, and services, in a multiplicity of modes, including automotive vehicles, heavy truck freight and logistics, public transit, traditional and emerging transportation and mobility modes, aviation, rail and marine, micromobility, and human-powered mobility. That is transportation as we know it. So what then is mobility? Well, OSU believes that mobility is transportation with a conscience. By conscience, we mean you need to take into account in an intelligent fashion all of the myriad environmental, economic, social, human health, and now increasingly public health externalities. We need to maximize the social good that mobility presents, that transportation presents to us as a society. And we wish to minimize the burdens and the cost to society of transportation. What then is the smart part of transportation? Well, the smart aspect is the deployment and use of information and communication technologies, ICT as it's known, including connectivity, control, optimization, the collection of data from a multiplicity of sensors and sources, and then using that data to optimize the selection, the use and control of all of the modes of mobility. And that has to be implemented across a range of scales, from the instantaneous through to the decadal choice, the choice that we make as a society over a period of decades as to how to implement transportation in society. And it's from the individual, the single individual in society, through to system-wide optimization. Of course, the pandemic is very interesting from one point of view, is that it's laid bare a lot of the underlying assumptions that we've made about transportation and mobility in society. And we'd like to talk about some of that today. So in summary, what is mobility? Well, it's transportation with a conscience. What has the pandemic done? It's upset many of the assumptions that we've made over the years and over the decades about transportation systems and how they work. What makes mobility smart? Well, it's information and communications technology applied across a range of timescales. And of course, if mobility is to be smart, we therefore need to learn from this pandemic. We need to take the opportunity that it presents to learn and to make our future transportation and mobility systems much smarter and much more resilient than before. So today we have, as I said, 5 experts and practitioners in mobility, including micromobility, city and regional planning, public transit, aviation, and the automotive sector. And I'll introduce each of them in turn. Firstly, I'd like to call upon Jennifer Clark. Jennifer is Professor and Head of City and Regional Planning in the Knowlton School of the College of Engineering at The Ohio State University. Jennifer, please give us your introduction.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that introduction to our webinar. And I would like to start by saying that this week, some of you will probably know, is Ohio State Staff and Faculty Appreciation Week. So I want to start by adding my voice to the thank yous to our staff in the College of Engineering and the College of Arts and Sciences and the Alumni Association for putting this together and for connecting all of us to have this important conversation today. So to start with, I think we are indeed in the process of rethinking mobility in the wake of COVID-19. As an exogenous shock, COVID-19 disrupts both transportation demand and transportation supply, thus challenging well-established models used for managing transportation systems, both for managing current operations and for much longer range planning. In many ways, COVID-19 is actually accelerating a rethinking of smart mobility at the conceptual level, which has been underway for at least the last 2 decades. COVID-19 adds to that existing challenge a system-wide disruption to current revenue models across the transportation industry. The conceptual shift underway in transportation planning and engineering affects the way we think about the movement of people, goods, and services at a variety of scales and the systems required to facilitate that movement. So in discussing new models like ride sharing, we often hear people talk about transportation as a service. The reality is that we are now seeing mobility as a much broader category than the way we conceptualized the transportation sector in the past. We now see mobility as infrastructure, such as bike lanes, scooter docking stations, wayfinding kiosks. We see mobility as a set of assets, varieties of which are owned by the public or the private sector or by individuals. We see mobility as a supply chain. We talk about the last mile, we talk about multimodal. And we also think about mobility as a labor market that ranges from gig workers all the way to more traditional employment relationships and formal occupations that are familiar to all of us. And ultimately, mobility is a choice involving more than movement from point to point. Importantly, we are rethinking not only our understanding of individual travel choices and firm strategies, but also entire mobility systems. Increasingly, we are seeing mobility as a socio-technical system rather than an engineering system alone. And in so doing, we open up the idea that choices made about mobility, both individually and in the aggregate, have implications beyond technical feasibilities and reach deeply into the questions about equity and sustainability, and now to public health. For example, over the last decade, transportation researchers have challenged people to rethink stigmas about non-car travel choices. A decade ago, ride sharing would possibly signal that one couldn't afford a car, that ride sharing was not a mobility choice, but a mobility necessity dictated by income constraints. This is not the case now. Similarly, we no longer see someone walking or biking and assume they couldn't afford a car. We now see these options as mobility choices rather than outcomes of constrained incomes. And now with COVID, we view choosing the immobility of e-commerce, grocery delivery, and remote work as a privilege, and the required mobility of travel to work and brick and mortar shopping as a sign of limited options. This is all to say that we are already rethinking mobility before COVID-19 arrived. What COVID-19 has done is accelerate this process by disrupting the models of transportation supply and demand we have come to rely on. Just as technology platforms push transportation as a service forward, COVID-19 is pushing us to develop new models for passenger aviation and public transit In particular, we may well see the end of dominant 20th century finance and revenue models in passenger transportation that allocate costs and risks between the public sector, private sector, and users and customers. It may indeed be that a rebalancing of costs and a rethinking of models, hub and spoke in aviation, the user fee model in public transit is what's in our future. In any case, innovation is needed in how we think about both passenger and freight transportation and how we pay for it. COVID-19 effectively shifts our efforts to move forward with smart mobility into a climbing gear. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I think one of the key takeaways from what you've just said is that the pandemic clearly is a remarkable tragedy for society. From the point of view of mobility and transportation, it's a remarkable experiment. It's an uncontrolled experiment that we never really planned, that no one ever really planned. And as such, as educators and as innovators and as practitioners, we need to take advantage of this very unfortunate circumstance to learn more and to do better in the future. Thanks again, Jennifer. Now I'd like to introduce Harvey Miller. Harvey is a professor of geography in the College of Arts and Sciences and the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. Harvey, please give us your introduction.
Hey, thank you, Chris. And also thank you, Jennifer, for laying an excellent foundation for our discussion this afternoon. So I'm a transportation geographer who studies sustainable mobility in cities, how to create transportation and urban systems that are environmentally friendly, socially just, and economically productive. And I'm also director of the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis. We are the hub for interdisciplinary urban science on campus. And we also serve as a bridge to the community for outreach, engagement, and research partnership on issues and challenges facing Ohio cities and beyond, of which transportation and mobility is a major challenge facing our cities in the 21st century. The immediate impact of COVID on urban mobility is huge. Clearly, we all can see this, and we can all see the effects. And as Chris mentioned, even though this event is unfortunate, it would be doubly unfortunate if we wouldn't use this opportunity to learn more about urban mobility and its impacts and how we should best move forward from this event. And that's what we've been trying to do in Cura. In the COVID pandemic, and indeed any pandemic, doesn't negate the need for sustainable mobility, and that's a message I want to give today. Sustainable mobility is a fundamental challenge for civilization in the 21st century as we move towards a highly urbanized planet. We're already a majority urban planet. We'll be almost totally urbanized by the end of the 21st century based on current trends. So our challenge moving forward is to create a sustainable and resilient mobility system. And these are not incompatible, in fact, are highly synergistic. So what have we seen so far in the near term of the impacts of COVID on urban mobility? Well, one thing we're seeing is bicycling is way up. And if you've tried to buy a bike recently, you know this, they are flying off the shelves. And this is very good news because we need more cycling in cities, and all of these purchases are demands for further bike mobility in cities. So this is a very good trend because biking is a green, healthy, social, and equitable form of urban mobility. What we need now is more bike infrastructure to protect these vulnerable road users. And that's something we don't have in many cities. Columbus and other cities do not have good protected bike infrastructure. And it's a major barrier for people using these bikes. And we also need to develop e-bikes, especially e-bike share, electric bikes, because they're a very underappreciated urban mobility revolution that can spread biking to a larger group of people. The other thing we're seeing is that public transit is down. Cura just completed a study where we analyzed decline in public transit demand at a national scale across all the public transit agencies in the country. And we've seen dramatic evidence of shrinkage in demand, but it's uneven, very uneven across cities. And it's also very uneven socially. We're seeing the people who are now riding public transit are people of low socioeconomic status, women, and people of color disproportionately still using public transit. The essential message there is that these are people performing essential jobs for whom public transit is essential. So even if you don't ride public transit, you are probably depending on somebody who depends on public transit. And that's something we have to think about going forward, making public transit safe. And I do think the fear of public transit has been overrated. There were some initial papers and research that came out to say that for example, New York City subway system was spreading COVID. More recent evidence and evidence from other systems around the world is saying that that's overblown. So I do believe there are ways that we can make public transit safe using very simple technologies and protocols such as masks and things like that, and rear boarding and touchless payment and things that the Central Ohio Transit Authority is in fact doing. The other thing we're seeing is that traffic is way down, but it's roaring back. And there's a fear among sustainable mobility scientists of a coming carpocalypse, a car apocalypse. If our civic leaders take the simple way out and continue to double down on our car-dominated mobility systems. That's the easy way out, but what we need to do is to transform our mobility systems dramatically going forward from this pandemic. Now, we've been doing some research on traffic patterns in Cura. One thing we found that got a lot of press attention was that extreme speeding is up in Ohio cities. And this has now been backed up by more tickets being issued by the Ohio Highway Patrol for extreme speeding, and traffic fatalities in Ohio being up, even though traffic and crashes are down. And that's a very serious problem. We're now following up the study with another study that links this extreme speeding data from ODOT with the extreme speeding data from the traffic data with the crash data from ODOT. So we'll be able to make some conclusive results pretty soon about that. We're also studying flows within cities. And one thing we're seeing is that the city, we're studying Columbus in particular, the city is essentially like disconnecting. That flows that overlap between neighborhoods where people are mixing for jobs, working, socializing, the city's becoming more localized and more disconnected. And there's some implications for social equity and transportation and for building community across our cities. So there are ways moving forward, and we can talk about this in the question and answer period, but we are studying these impacts, and we are using this as an opportunity to learn how to build these more sustainable and resilient urban mobility systems going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harvey. And yes, as you've reiterated, there's an enormous amount of data that we can, that researchers and educators will sift through for decades to come, looking at the effect of the pandemic on various modes of transportation and mobility. Now I'd like to introduce Sophia Moore. Sophia is the Chief Innovation Officer of COTA, the Central Ohio Transit Authority. By way of introduction, I'd like to say, whereas most of us are educators and researchers and developers, Sophia is very much on the front lines of mobility and transportation in the pandemic. So Sophia, tell us what COTA has been doing for the last several months.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for that introduction. And Harvey, thank you so much for that introduction regarding public transit. I am the Chief Innovation Officer at COTA, and it's been a really interesting time here. And when you talk about innovation, I think that COVID and the pandemic has really focused on how, as a transit authority, we have had to be really innovative based on everything that's happened. Prior to COVID, COTA had the highest ridership since 1988 of 19 million passenger trips a year. Our passenger growth was growing with choice riders as well as those who are transit dependent. However, when the pandemic hit Central Ohio, we went from approximately 65,000 passenger trips a day to 20,000 a day. And that was a 65% reduction. And not only that, we also had to spend in many lines. We went from 42 full-time fixed route lines to 21. So one of the many things that we've been focusing on is how can we make sure that our customers, but also our operators, really feel safe during the pandemic. As Harvey has talked about, and also Chris has talked about, that this has become more about providing that essential service to essential workers. And we are really dependent on them to making sure that we get all the means that we have, and that COTA is really their primary means of transportation. And it has really been making sure that we provide that essential need, but also, making sure we understand where that need is at. And I think it's really focused us in the future about how do we look at our service today and what do we need to do tomorrow? So how can we make sure that our customers and our frontline employees feel safe CODA implemented many items such as in the beginning of the pandemic, such as rear boarding. We also have a limit of 20 passengers per vehicle to make sure that everyone feels safe as our customers. And we also implemented free fares. As we talked about, this has been a transportation focus for our customers to make sure that they can get to what they need, whether it be work or to services. And CODA was one of the first to implement the rear boarding and free fares to make sure that that transportation was there. But this has really been an example of how we're trying to be innovative and understanding what does public transportation look like in the future, and how do we need to structure that so they feel safe, and as things come back, that we are really responding to the needs of the community as the community changes and public transportation changes.
Thanks very much, Sophia. Thank you for giving us that insight. And as I said, Sophia is very much a practitioner on the front line of transit in Central Ohio. And similarly, Stephanie Morgan, who is the Executive Director of the Air Transportation and Aerospace Campus at Ohio State University. Stephanie, you've been telling us about how your operations have been disrupted over the last several months. Please offer us your insights. Thanks. So Stephanie, you're muted.
How's that? Does that sound better? Okay, I was trying something best. It didn't even work out, but that's okay. So before I get into the COVID, I have to brag on my campus because I'm not so sure that everybody's on the same page. Does everybody out there, does everybody out there know that The Ohio State has an airport? Whoop, 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 whoop. Okay, not only that, an airport with 3 runways. How about this? How about the 3rd busiest airport in the state of Ohio? That's pretty cool, huh? All right, so then if you even go back, we've got about 5,000 public use airports in the United States. And of those 5,000, there's about 550 airports that have a set of standards that are called FAA 139, which makes our airport safe. And of the 550, we're one of them. We operate our airport just like Atlanta, John Glenn, New York on our safety standards. So that's something, right? So let me tell you, even better, there's only 26 airports out there under a college. That's pretty cool, huh? So we're pretty proud of that. Not only that, let me give you something. $157 million economic impact just on the airport. Now you're talking about flight education. Oh, wait a minute. We've got flight education. Yes, we do. So we've got 165 students that just signed up for our fall, 70 on the wait list, doing something right. And of that, we've got an excellent return side of it. They graduate, they've got jobs. COVID really has impacted us too much on that, because what we look at is the future of aviation industry itself. If you look in the future, we're looking at long term, we still have the pilot shortage, we still have a mechanic shortage, we still need skilled people with even aviation management out there. So we have a shortage. Has COVID impacted us? COVID has impacted all transportation. That's what you're going to hear in today's session. Wait a minute, I got more. Air Transportation Campus also includes aerospace research. Average research, $6.4 million. What do? Core competencies, gas, turbine. We do aerodynamics, flow control, unmanned aircraft systems. COVID is going to impact that. Innovation, technology. How about hypersonics? And this is where we are. I think we are in a really good place to be able to look in the future and to be able to say, okay, here's what's happening, but what can we do that's going to make it better for us? We have opportunities here. Everything has been impacted. You look at US airlines, passengers down 75%. TSA checkpoint down 74%. But what's happening is the general aviation airport side of it, it's starting to pick up. We're already at normal capacity. Why? Because we also have business jets out there. People are opting for business jets, fractionals, net jets, wheels up, they have to go somewhere, right? Which is great. Zoom is awesome. It's not the same. You still want to go out there to your board members and your stakeholders. So I had to do a little bit of bragging. We had a little pause March and April for our flight education. Just a little pause. Okay, a lot of pause, 90% down, 96% on our operations. But if you looked at the entire year for FY19 and 20, we're up 7% on our operations. That's how busy of an airport we are. So we're doing great. I wanted to real quick thanks the alums, the support, the sponsorships. We wouldn't be there if it wasn't for NetJets, for Austin U. Knowlton, and our sponsorships and all the community support. So I'll get off my soapbox. I know I've got Giorgio is ready to go, but thank you. Good to see you.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Thanks for giving us an upbeat message about aviation and aerospace studies at Ohio State. We've spoken about aviation, public transit, city and regional planning, micromobility. Harvey discussed the effect on vehicle traffic numbers. And we're now going to have Giorgio Rizzoni, who's the director of the Center for Automotive Research and the Ford Motor Company Chair in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at OSU. Giorgio, please tell us about your vehicle work at OSU and how it's been impacted by the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Chris, and thank you for to all of the other panelists for presenting such a clear picture of how, in many ways, the pandemic has affected many aspects of mobility and will probably have a lasting impact on land use and on the use of various mobility services, including transit. As Chris has mentioned, I'm with the Center for Automotive Research. My sort of career has been spent working in collaboration with the automotive industry. So this is something that, of course, has had a profound impact on the automotive industry. And in any country that is a major producer of cars and trucks, the automotive industry represents a significant segment of the economic throughput of the country. That is certainly true in the United States, where we have not only, let me call them domestic US-based manufacturers, but many companies that globally operate in the US. So if you were to look at the numbers, this is something that between the manufacturers and suppliers represents a significant number of jobs in the country. So how will the pandemic affect the automotive industry? And this is something that I will divide into two parts. One of it has to do with moving people. And I think that questions about how personal mobility will be affected and how the vehicles that we use are going to change going forward is probably a harder question. I think we will see a lot more micromobility solutions. Harvey certainly has talked about bicycles and e-bikes, but I think that there are going to be a number of alternatives that will have to be in existence to enable, especially for urban mobility, to enable micromobility and keep people on the go as in a way that is different from the traditional model of the commute around the Beltway and driving to the city. There will be some questions, I'm sure, and I suspect that we will go back to this topic later. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about moving goods, because one of the clear effects of the last several months has been a giant increase, a significant increase in e-commerce. E-commerce was already an established reality, but the way we have dealt with replacing retail shopping, replacing food procurement, for example, with door-to-door delivery, and the expectations that have come with these delivery services has created an interesting or a very rapid change in the package delivery industry, in the freight delivery industry. So I think we're going to see some dramatic changes, probably more rapidly in the commercial vehicle industry than we're going to see in the passenger car industry. They're already taking place. It'll become economically more effective, I think, for the package delivery companies, your UPS, FedEx, to deliver door to door. It's a different business model than business to business. The increase in door to door delivery actually increases complexity and cost for these companies. And I think we will see a substantial increase in electrification of these vehicles for a number of reasons. We will also see changes in how they manage mobility hubs. There will be a need, of course, for a change in charging infrastructure. So I am convinced that this has been a step change in the world of the package delivery industry that will rapidly have an impact on how we see this door-to-door deliveries. As far as what passenger cars and personal mobility goes, we can all imagine single occupancy vehicles. I'll state just one statistic or a fact. I recently saw some statistics from the Environmental Protection Agency on traffic patterns in the greater Los Angeles areas. It's a fascinating curve. You can see that during the months of March, April, May, traffic patterns went down significantly, but they're back up again. Today, the traffic patterns in the greater LA area are not too dissimilar from what they were 6 months ago. So single occupancy will be important. People will feel safer that way. Are we driving the right kind of automobiles? Is the automotive industry producing the right kind of automobiles for this different type of mobility? So these are all questions that we ask ourselves, and I am sure that during the course of the conversation that is about to take place, we'll address some of them. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you again, and we will open, I think, the conversation.
Thanks very much, Giorgio. Appreciate that. Yeah, now we've received a number of questions on the Q&A, and we're going to start answering some of them. Initially, I'll direct them to individual panelists, but at some point, the rest of the panelists should feel free to chime in. Jennifer Clark, as city and regional planning expert, how will city and urban and regional planning change post-pandemic? You know, this is obviously a burning question. What are we going to learn from the pandemic, and how are we going to apply it in the future?
Thank you for an easy question, Chris. Really appreciate that. There's some debates in city and regional planning about this point. There are some people from sort of the urbanist side of the story who think that that lower density is going to be the next step. And then there are some of us who think that that is not likely at all to be the outcome. But I think probably the top line answer to that and the summary answer to that would really be that this issue of being more deliberate about how city and regional planning is actually managed and thought about. And we've had the opportunity to start doing that in the last, I would say, 10 years. The smart cities conversation that we were already having about the intersections of technology and cities allowed us to rethink cities as systems, and thinking about not for the purposes of creating an urban operating system or something like that, but more to the understanding that we're looking at different overlays of different systems that operate within the urban environment. So thinking about things like, as Harv was talking about, what is infrastructure for transportation? Is it only roads, and are roads only for cars? Or are we going to think bigger than that? Are we going to think about a more integrated approach than that? So we were already thinking that way a bit when we were talking about things like transit-oriented development, which is really about the intersections of economic development, urban land use planning, and transportation planning. So this idea that we're moving beyond silos. I think, again, you know, the issue with a public health crisis of this magnitude is it reminds us, and possibly in a pretty horrible way, reminds us that public health is part of that intersection too. Thinking about how that piece of it was something that we kind of looked at as distinct and separate. And indeed, it's not distinct and separate. It's another one of the systems we need to consider in urban planning.
I think you've raised a very good point, which is now, just as we consider the externalities of the environmental impact or burden of various transportation modes and mobility, the economic impact, now the social impact, and now increasingly the social justice impact. Now we need to consider the public health impact on all of, on our choice and selection of transportation modes, and how we modify transportation and mobility systems in the future. Harvey, a question for you, and it pertains to the divergence that you mentioned between cities, suburbs, and exurbs and rural areas. I think you used the term disconnected, you said that various portions of cities were becoming disconnected from each other. Obviously, as we've upset patterns, regular commuting patterns, for example, people not going to work, children not going to school, people not going to shopping malls and sporting events and religious events. As you say, there's a disconnect. There's an increasing disconnect. Are we going to see transportation systems and mobility systems diverge? Will there be one for the city and one for the suburbs, one for the exurbs, one for the rural areas? What will happen in the future, do you think?
Boy, I hope not. That would be a disaster. Well, what we're seeing right now is that cities are disconnecting is because people just aren't traveling as much, especially over longer distances and across different neighborhoods. But when we want to create communities, I mean, mobility is essential to creating communities. Mobility is how we organize our cities. So I think we can create an urban transportation system that's sustainable, that's equitable, innovative, and also socially just. But we can't do that, extend that into the suburbs. For example, if you live in Central Ohio, some of you know everyone should know the suburb of Dublin. And Dublin's actually doing some proper things for the future in terms of densifying and hardening and creating walkable spaces in their city center. In the future, that could be connected to Columbus and to other nodes in the system via high quality public transit, including light rail. I think we'll always have a need, of course, for automobiles in exurban areas and rural areas, of course. We'll even need them in cities, but I just think what we need to do is rebalance our transportation systems. Right now, we just have one system, which is automobiles, and that works better in some places, perhaps in the suburbs and exurbs and rural areas, but it doesn't match well with the city center. So if we really had an integrated mobility ecosystem where we had multiple options, we could create this type of regional access. And we did in the past. 100 years ago, you could take a train between any cities in Ohio, even small towns. We had one of the densest passenger rail networks in the world. In Ohio,
Georgia, I remember
ago.
that 100 years ago, right, Harvey? Yeah, we remember that one. Yeah, we're on it.
Okay, but I wasn't there, but we had this system and we got rid of it. So it is possible because we did it before.
Thanks, Harvey. Thanks. And Sophia, you were talking about COTA and how COTA has changed its methods of practice as a result of the pandemic. And obviously, transit has been absolutely essential for frontline workers to get from their homes to their places of employment. The question is the following: how can we ensure, as Harvey has suggested, that transit remains viable in the future from an economic, environmental, and social equity point of view? How can we ensure the viability of public transit in the future?
Yeah, Chris, thank you for that question, and thank the audience for that question. It's a great question, and it's something that we talk about at COTA every day, is that we can really take this opportunity to either rebuild or reinvent. And I think in the rebuild model, it assumes that things are going to go back to the way they were. And I think not just in mobility, but in many aspects. Things are not going to go back to the way they were. And mobility has forever changed. And we really need to respond to that as a transit organization. And we really need to evaluate our customer needs and their concerns and make sure that we provide the best mobility options for them. And that means a lot of different things that we're looking at. And I think data is something that Harvey has talked about is number one, is that we need to understand, what their needs are today, where are they going today, and making sure that we're responsive to our customer needs. And also understand customer sentiment and really understand, how are they feeling about transit? Where do they need to go? What types of things does transit need to provide to them? So it's really become a focus area for us. But there's other aspects that we need to look at too, is the economic aspects. Even though we are suspending lines, we're also making sure on a constant basis that we're keeping an eye out for job centers and making sure that there are means of transportation to those locations so we don't make it more challenging for people to go to work, especially for those essential services. And social equity is a big part of something that we talk about every day at CODA, is that at CODA, the mission is about moving every life forward. And a big part of that is also about not leaving anyone behind. And we want to make sure that we move people to opportunity, but sometimes that also means providing opportunity to people. So it has allowed us to reinvent ourselves and look at ourselves in a different way. Some recent things that we've done at CODA is, even though we may have suspended a line in an area, we are currently testing out CODA on demand in the Northeast Columbus area. As we all know, some students are challenged without having broadband access. So rather than, we're trying to bring broadband to them with Wi-Fi by CODA. And we've also used CODA to provide food opportunities as well for food distribution. So we're really trying to make sure that we're not just about transportation, but we're providing opportunity for people. So I think it really focuses on how do we look at public transit in a different way, and making sure that we're responsive to the new needs, and that, again, we're looking at moving every life forward, and that we're thinking about all of those social equity, economic and environmental types of things as we move forward.
So as you say, it's what this pandemic has shown is that public transit is absolutely essential for the functioning of a city, for the functioning of a society. And I certainly hope, for one, that that message moves forward. Public transit typically has a bad rap, but it's proven to be absolutely invaluable in, as I said, getting frontline workers from home to work in an expeditious and efficient fashion. And we certainly hope that that message is carried forward. And wish you the best of luck in that respect. Stephanie, we've been getting a number of questions about air travel. Obviously, it's been enormously disrupted, and by air travel, we mean business and leisure travel, commercial aviation. A running question is, how long will the current disruption last? In your opinion, how long will the current disruption commercially?
Well, since I've been here over 100 years, let me look into my crystal ball for that one, right? We've never seen anything like this before. The SARS, we just have not seen anything, 9/11. So this is something that we've never dealt with. If you look at the stats that are coming in every day, I mean, it's really interesting if you look on the internet to be able to grab the data itself. What it's really showing at this point is that it really looked like May and June were looking pretty promising, because we were thinking, oh, we got some safe zones, and I think that we're looking that we're feeling a little safe to travel. And I think that's probably all transportation. What happened in July? In July, we have a resurgence. So then the public is not quite as comfortable to travel. Right now, what we can do is just keep doing what we're doing. The airlines themselves are taking some great actions to be able to sustain, because it's a global issue. It's not just US, it's not domestic, it's a global issue. So right now we're seeing domestic is upticking a little bit more promising than international right now. Some of that might be hub versus point to point. The data is still not quite clear on that. But some of the things that the airline are doing, I think, is something that most transportations probably can do is cut capacity, unfortunately. But they're really laser focusing on what makes sense. They're actually retiring the older equipment in the aircraft. They're actually utilizing aircraft probably a little bit better. They're balancing the cargo side of it. How can we actually utilize things? All those types of changes that the airline are making will make a difference on our G&A, because we're looking at complete issues on a lot of different aspects, especially the economy side. So I don't have the answer to that. Hopefully when we get a vaccine or effective treatment, and when our customers feel a little bit more comfortable to travel, then we'll be able to see something that we can reimagine. I think that's going to be the key, kind of what Sophia and Jennifer have been talking about, is not so much that we're really trying to go to the old because everything is this new normal, but how about something that the College of Engineering Leadership says a lot? We have to reimagine how it's going to look, and then be able to predict and be able to get ahead of it with technology and innovation.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. And as you pointed out, general aviation and business aviation are at elevated levels, but it is commercial aviation, obviously, which has suffered significantly. Giorgio, a question for you. If the pandemic has shown a significant reversion to the use of private cars for transportation, is this a permanent shift? And if so, what should OSU be doing in terms of its education, research, development, and innovation agenda? What should OSU be doing to reduce the environmental burden of privately owned, individually operated automobiles?
So two angles here. On the personal mobility passenger car side, I would say that we are likely to see in the near term a further increase in interest in at least partially automated functions in vehicles. I think it's been very clearly shown and demonstrated already that the availability of data makes it possible to provide better transit services, for example, but it also makes it possible for individual vehicle operators to take advantage of opportunities to optimize their route, optimize their vehicle operation. And the more we incorporate automated functions in these vehicles, the easier it will be to take advantage of the information that is available to us and to distribute traffic in such a way that there will be a favorable impact on emissions. One of the things that is oftentimes lost, we spend so much time thinking about local tailpipe emissions from a single vehicle, but the systems level improvements that one can achieve in lowering overall emission from mobile sources, if we have a more organized, more intelligent traffic patterns, I think is an order of magnitude greater than the improvements you can make by just tweaking the technology. That's one element. I think that connectivity and automation will be part of the answer to that question. I also think that urban mobility will be increasingly electric, and I think a mix of modes, of mobility modes in which micromobility will be predominantly electric. There is no reason to not do that. Is something that I think is coming, but I think that there is a chicken and egg problem there with the way the vehicle market is today, what the automotive industry produces, and so that's something that I think is going to take some time. The need for it is definitely increasing and not going away. On the commercial vehicle side, on the other hand, I think that some of these things will happen rather quickly. And it's again the same technologies that I just mentioned, connectivity and automation. You can imagine that in local distribution centers, mobility hubs for package delivery companies, for example, you can easily imagine that automation locally, not necessarily automation on the public roads, but automation that has to do with the loading of the packages, the moving of the vehicles within the mobility center, is something that will see increasing presence. And as I said earlier, I also think that electrification is likely to become more and a larger and larger fraction of the total in these urban package delivery type vehicles. So from our perspective, we are working on all of these topics, and we will continue to support and assist the automotive industry at large, whether they make components and systems, whether they process information, whether they make trucks or cars or innovative single occupancy vehicles. We think that there are great opportunities to facilitate and accelerate this transition.
So your vote is for connectivity, increased levels of connectivity and automation amongst vehicles, and increased electrification. And yes, and that dovetails nicely with the electrification of micromobility and increases in human-powered mobility, people walking, people riding bikes. One thing we haven't touched on, and is probably a topic for another webinar at least, is increases in light rail within cities in Ohio, and then high-speed rail intercity. And obviously those are very important issues that, as I say, should be addressed probably at a later stage. I have a question for all the panelists. You know, there's been talk since the dawn of the computer age, let's call it, for the last 50 years, about travel replacement. In other words, what if we could replace, what if there wasn't an incentive for business travel? What if there was less of an incentive for business travel? What if there was less of an incentive for commuting to work, for example? You know, and there are emerging computer techniques in augmented reality and virtual reality that could potentially remove or reduce, certainly significantly reduce the requirement for travel in the future. I think that this pandemic has created, as I said earlier, an experiment, a completely uncontrolled experiment in looking at computer-based technologies as travel replacement. I'm not sure that people are entirely satisfied or happy with the outcome. But what is there in the terms of travel replacement? Does the panel think that that will be a significant lasting effect of the pandemic? Anybody?
I think it's been happening already for quite some time. We all remember when if you wanted to see someone, you drove or flew there, but we have been using telework tools, let me just call them generally that way, for quite some time now. The acceleration that we have seen in this pandemic era has been phenomenal. I just to give you an example, I was giving a final exam at an Italian university the other day over Zoom. So my take is that this was a process that was inching along, and we've given it a step change. And it is actually largely satisfactory. You can do a lot.
Anyone else, panelists?
I think it's going to be complicated because one thing that we're discovering about like education and cities and social life is that we miss being with each other. You know, I mean, that's one thing we've all discovered is how much we're missing the human touch. So it might be that things like business travel are substituted and perhaps commuting. Perhaps some people will work at home more, but it doesn't mean that people aren't going to gather and travel and be mobile. So I'm not totally convinced that this is going to happen. I think it's going to be very complex and uneven effects. And we're going to see, because a lot of this depends upon the social processes and how things reorganize around our new mobility future.
Indeed, indeed. Any other panelists' observations on travel replacement?
I'm worried as well about, I think, for those of us who have had the time in our careers to make the connections, those global connections, those international connections, you know, we can pause. For our students, for our emerging researchers and early career researchers, for them to miss out on creating that global network that really pushes innovation forward, pushes research forward, I think we may miss that in ways we can't even imagine right now, that benefits of that kind of global connection and idea exchange. I think it's incalculable. So it concerns me.
Indeed, missing out on the face-to-face interactions is, as Harvey and Jennifer have been saying, you miss half of the interaction at least. It's not clear that augmented reality or virtual reality will get anywhere close in any reasonable time frame. So in order to wrap up, what I would like to ask each of the panelists is, what else should OSU be doing in this area of mobility? Knowing what we now know about the pandemic and the disruptions that it's caused, what else should OSU be doing in the area of mobility and smart mobility? Let's start with Stephanie.
I think the Ohio State University does a really good job. I think that we definitely could branch and expand innovation, technology, electric, was something that we're looking to partner with urban air mobility. I think those are areas that we will see. We talked about how it's potentially going to change. I don't particularly see that air travel will change in the future. I think it's definitely going to change, but I think it's going to get better. I think it's being more efficient. I think it's be cleaner as far as the engines itself, is inside and outside. I can see that being a great change. So I think that we can partner more and also expand. Thinking outside the box is where I think that we really excel. And I think that we do a really good job. And I just would like to see it expand some more. To give you an example, our aerospace research has great foundation. We just need more partners to expand it. And our flight education as well. We could use more partners as well to expand it. So we're just limited on what we're limited on. And I think that's what we need to do is just keep expanding, keep growing. We're doing a great job, great team.
Thanks
Happy to
very
be here.
much. Thanks, Stephanie. Thank you. And Sophia, as an outside stakeholder, as Chief of Innovation at COTA, in 30 seconds, what do you think OSU should do as a land-grant institution in terms of developing solutions for mobility in the future?
As I talked about, I think that we're really focused on reinvention, but that means we're focused on really understanding how mobility has changed in the Central Ohio area. So I think a great way that OSU could help is really understanding the data that they're seeing, the research that they're seeing, best practices that they're seeing, and helping us understand so we can respond better as well to continue to make public transit relevant and accessible for everybody.
Thanks, Sophia. And Giorgio, in 30 seconds, what else should OSU be doing in the mobility area?
Let engineering meet the social sciences, the mobility community, land use, and city and regional planning. Let all of these things come together, because the answer is a combination of all of these factors, which are so well represented on our panel today. We need to work with one another, and I think that the breadth of what Ohio State does permits that. We have excellence in all of these areas.
Thanks very much. And Harvey, what's your opinion?
Well, I think Giorgio's right. And I think we need more convergent mobility research, because we realize that mobility is a very complex problem involving physical, engineering, technological, social, and environmental dimensions of it. And I think we're doing that already at Ohio State. We already have convergent mobility research going on, and it's a very collaborative environment here for this type of research. I think our big challenge is going to be in education. We have to educate the next generation mobility professional who's less stovepiped and by modes or by applications, and has to have a more holistic and integrated view of transportation across modes and from the individual to the entire system, and also the ability to work within the new data and computation-rich environment we have for mobility. That's not an easy order to fill, and it's something we really have to think hard about here at Ohio State.
Thanks very much, and thanks for reminding all of us of the strong educational aspect to our duty. Jennifer, what's your opinion?
Very close to Harv's, which is that this is an interdisciplinary issue. It's multimodal, it's interoperability across systems, and it needs to connect our research and our teaching. and bringing our students and bringing some of these incredible junior faculty to the table is a big part of us moving that forward. So I'm excited about the progress we're making.
Well, thanks very much. We greatly appreciate the panelists' efforts and time. And of course, you, the audience, we greatly appreciate you. You'll be hearing from the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of Engineering and the Ohio State University Alumni Association with a survey. And we would ask that you would complete the survey and share your opinions about this webinar and about the questions that it's uncovered. Please respond to the post-event email with your questions and comments, audience. And thanks again to the panelists, and thanks to you, the audience. We greatly appreciate it, and we certainly enjoyed it. We'd like to keep up the dialogue. Thanks again, panelists. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thanks to our speakers for sharing their knowledge. We encourage you to check out our upcoming virtual events. Join us next Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a book club discussion about Beloved by Toni Morrison. We appreciate you all. Stay safe and go Buckeyes.